toxic masculinity.
LAPD expert paid $13,000 to testify that Derek Chauvin used excessive force.
Very well done,
So
madam.
complicated for me to read.
Derek Chauvin used excessive force on George Floyd, LAPD expert says. They had to bring in somebody from Los Angeles to testify, and then they paid him $13,000. Here's $13,000. Just say what we want you to say. You know,
Why Los Angeles?
it sounds fancy. Somebody, an expert
From Los Angeles.
Yeah. Let's read this. A Los Angeles Police Department expert on police use of force offered paid testimony Tuesday that Derek Chauvin used excessive force during George Floyd's police custody death. LAPD Sergeant Jody Steger, who has recently received nearly $13,000 to testify in the case, said at Chauvin's murder trial that the former Minneapolis police's knee restraint on Floyd's neck was not standard practice. But see, this is ridiculous for him to say because it was standard practice in Minnesota. Those officers are taught to restrain people in that manner specifically. Now, people are complaining. Now they've shifted the goalpost, right? They've said, oh, well, it wasn't that he used the knee to the neck, because that was standard procedure. It was that he used the knee to the neck for too long. So they've shifted it from just using knee to the neck, which everybody said that was actually a bad thing for them to do. Now they said, well, he used it for too long. But this guy's saying this wasn't standard practice, but it was standard practice in Minnesota.
Well, let's start that he didn't die from knee on the neck.
No, he didn't die from the knee on the neck.
He had like 4 or 5 different drugs in his blood.
Well,
he was tested positive for COVID. Why don't you write that he died from COVID? As you did it for the whole year.
I know everybody who dies. There's a video that somebody posted the other day from early on. I think it was in 2020 when the virus was everybody was still terrified of it and everything. And they were like, just to be clear, when we count COVID deaths, we're just counting deaths of people who test positive for COVID. We're not trying to determine whether or not COVID caused the death. Mm-hmm. And so I'm in a position now where I'm thinking like, deaths have dropped so much that how many deaths do we have that are even of COVID anymore at all? Like it could be that no deaths are of COVID because they're just basically counting any death in which somebody has contracted COVID as a COVID death. So you still have old people dying left and right because old people just die all the time. And that's part of the way the world works.
Yeah.
And if they've caught COVID, doesn't matter how successful the treatments have been for COVID, if they die and they've contracted COVID, it's a COVID death. So now all the deaths that we're counting all the time could be nothing to do with COVID at this point. COVID could be done, as far as we know. Because they're still counting deaths, from what I understand, they're still counting deaths as COVID deaths, even if they're just testing positive for COVID, but not actually dying of COVID. Anyway, that's a tangent. I do apologize. Let me continue reading this story. LAPD Sergeant, okay, I already read that bit. Based upon your review of these materials, what is your opinion as to the degree of force used by the defendant on Mr. Floyd? Prosecutor Steve Schleicher asked. My opinion was that the force was excessive, Steger responded. Steger said he considered several factors in coming to that conclusion, including the severity of the offense that led to Floyd's arrest, passing a counterfeit $20 bill. Typically, in a normal situation, when you're dealing with somebody who is a counterfeiter or somebody who's using a counterfeit bill, typically you wouldn't even expect to use any kind of force, Steger testified. And we'll get into some of the more details here in a second, but I want to say that, like, the counterfeit bill issue was merely the spark that set off this situation. It was not the fire that the officer was trying to put out by restraining George Floyd. Everybody always says, like, he was killed for having a $20 bill. That's actually not true. The reason that George Floyd died, first of all, was that he had 3 times a lethal dose of fentanyl. That was the main drug that is suspected by anybody who has looked at the autopsy report. That's the main cause of death as far as anybody sensible believes, right? One thing that's a little bit interesting, actually, I had somebody contact me who's a pharmacist and who knows a little bit about drug overdoses and stuff like this. Somebody I know personally. And they're a Democrat, and they thought, well, actually, you can survive a lethal dose of fentanyl if you're an addict. If you're an addict of a particular kind of drug, then your body becomes much more tolerant of that drug. And what is considered to be a lethal dose of a drug may not be lethal to you. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, but not if you have other drugs in your...
Not only that, not only the other drugs, but also 3 times a fatal dose to me. Even if you are, if you do have a tolerance to that drug, 3 times the fatal dose, that's not something that can just be ignored. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh, no, we got to ignore the fentanyl because he was a drug addict. So for sure that didn't kill him. I'm not sure that didn't kill him. Because he one of the main symptoms of a fentanyl overdose is the fact that you can't breathe, right? And
he was saying that he can't breathe for like 5 minutes before they put him.
Well, this is the point that I
down.
made. This is the point I made to this person who was writing me, and they wrote back and they said exactly as if that supported their point, which I didn't actually quite understand. I didn't follow up on, but they seemed to think that because he was experiencing an overdose of fentanyl, that the police use of force was inappropriate because it would then potentially contribute to his death. But here's the problem as I see it. We're kind of expecting police officers now, I guess, to be doctors and to be able to diagnose people with problems. Like, this guy is taught if a suspect is resisting arrest, if they're acting erratically, if they're trying to get away, which George Floyd seemed to be doing, then they should restrain them with a knee to the neck. That seemed to be the most appropriate technique to restrain somebody, according to the Minnesota Police Department, which is where Chauvin worked, and that's how he was trained, right? So he basically did everything by the book. People are saying, "Oh, you did it for too long." This is what I would say to you had the knee to the neck for too long argument. If you watch the full video from the moment he walks up to George Floyd to the moment George Floyd is carted off on one of those gurneys, George Floyd was trying to get out of it. He was trying to escape. He was using every trick he could think of to get out of that arrest. He was begging the officers. He actually physically tried to move from one side of the police car through the police car to the other side of the police car, and actually succeeded in getting out of the police car and trying to slither his way out. He was trying to trick the police officers. He was complaining about, he was saying that he thinks he's going to die and all this kind of stuff, even though his life wasn't in any danger in terms of dealing with the police officers. He kept insisting on sitting in the front seat for some reason because he was claustrophobic. And there's a lot of weird stuff that George Floyd was saying. Now, I've watched the show Cops. I've seen a lot of people that are high on drugs or drunk or just a little bit crazy trying to get out of arrests and stuff like that. Police deal with suspects who are acting erratic all the time. Those suspects haven't usually ingested a lethal dose of a drug to the point where, the officer can see, obviously, this person is about to die. If you're dealing with people all the time that are acting erratically because they're on drugs, you are trained to react to them in certain ways. There is no way, as far as I'm aware, that Chauvin would have been able to tell, oh, this guy took 3 times the lethal dose of fentanyl and he's going to die. If he had known that, and if he had been told, if you put your knee to his neck, it will contribute to his death in some way, then maybe you could make a case that he's culpable in some way. But this idea that police officers have to be doctors now and be able to diagnose everybody with any kind of condition and be able to determine when somebody's overdosed on drugs, that's just not realistic. I mean, you could definitely implement that kind of training and try to encourage cops to be able to see it and not. But you cannot expect people who are not trained medical professionals to know these things. Derek Chauvin, I believe, was acting in the way he was trained to act. So if you have a problem with the way he acted, you have to take it up with the people who trained him, not with Derek Chauvin himself, who just did his job. That's how I look at it. But other people are trying to say, oh, no, it was excessive force. It was excessive force. It's like, I don't know. To me, it's like they brought this guy in as an expert, but they paid him $13,000. To me, that automatically indicates that his testimony has been bought. He has been bought.
Everything is bought. Even the expertise of the reason why he died. Like, they did one expertise was like a state, and it says he died from overdose. There's another expertise, like a military whatever. I don't know exactly. And they said the same thing. And then they found some private company. They did the results as they wanted them to do this.
Right. Yeah.
I don't understand how they.
Well, there's a lot of politics at stake here because Black Lives Matter movement, right? A lot of the Black Lives Matter movement was built on the death of George Floyd. So they need to find.
I'm so pissed off of this situation that the only words I can it's swearing words. But I don't know what to say.
Well, why don't you just swear in Russian and then it's a little bit like people.
So messed up.
Yeah, it is messed up. It's messed up.
He's not supposed to go to prison.
Let's see here. No, he shouldn't go to prison. So then Steger, this supposed expert, was asked, typically in a normal situation where you're dealing with somebody. Oh no, that was what Steger said. But and then Schleicher, who's the attorney here, prosecutor, also showed Steger a photo of Chauvin pressing his knee down on Floyd's neck. Can you describe what you see here? The prosecutor asked. This is so theatrical. Steger said, "I see an officer with his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd. Is this the form of force?" Schleicher asked. "Yes," Steger replied. Steger, a consultant and expert on the use of force, said he was hired by state prosecutors to review documents and testify in the high-profile murder case. He conceded that Floyd was initially actively resisting officers, but he said once he was placed in the prone position on the ground, he slowly ceased his resistance and said the cops should have stopped using force. No, I disagree with this massively. And the reason I disagree with this is because if this guy has used a bunch of different tricks, tricky language, tricky physical movements, the guy's as big as he is, and the officers think that he's potentially using another trick to escape, right? Playing dead, right? That's another trick. You can pretend that you're not resisting until they move and then run. Right, which I'm sure happens to cops all the time. It's sort of like, George Floyd was saying, "Oh, I can't breathe," and we probably couldn't breathe because of the drugs. But at the time, it sounded like a lie. It sounded like an excuse. And saying, "Oh, I'm claustrophobic. I can't sit in the back seat. I have to sit in the front seat." All these things seemed like excuses. They seemed like, it seemed like he was crying wolf a lot. Right? You know the story of the boy who cried wolf? Okay. And so this idea of him no longer resisting could have meant that indeed he had stopped resisting, but it also could have meant that he was faking. And so I think that probably in Derek Chauvin's mind,
he was feeling like it's hard for him to breathe. But if it's hard for you to breathe and you took a lot of drugs, then just sit down, don't move.
Get in the car.
Because you're gonna. The situation is going to get worse.
But I think it was out of his mind on drugs is the problem, which is look, that's a tragedy.
I understand.
That's a tragedy. You shouldn't, it's a shame that people die of drug overdoses. It's a shame that people do this. But that doesn't mean that Derek Chauvin has to go to prison because...
And people always say, "Oh, he called his mom. It was so sad to watch." Well, there was another black guy who is on a parole, was kicking the Asian girl in the head, and he was on parole from killing his own mother.
Killed his own mother,
It's mother. I mean, people like, "Oh, he calling his mother." It doesn't. For me, it doesn't mean anything.
You're saying some people hate their mothers? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. A comparison
it's
between those two.
To hear, "Oh, he called his mother," is like so sad. But you neglecting his criminal history.
Here's what I think. If you're out of your mind on drugs, it's tough. That's a tough thing. Police have to deal with it in whatever way they can. It's messy. Sometimes it's not always perfect. It's not always done perfectly because every case is different. Every case is difficult. And, police have to be given some discretion to do their jobs in the way that they think is fit at the time. You can't expect cops to know for sure this person is dying. I mean, it looked like he was lying for most of the thing. The fact that he was actually probably suffocating to death because of the drug overdose. What he should have done, what could have saved his life, and what probably would have saved his life, is he said, look, when you came up to the car, I needed to get rid of these drugs, so I took them all at once. I think I'm dying of a drug overdose. If he had said that, these guys would have been, oh, okay, call the medics over. I think the medics were on their way anyway. But then there would have been some kind of perception of what was happening, and maybe he could have been treated.
Well, what done is done. We can't.
Yeah, you can't go back in time and save the guy's life.
Unfortunately.
All right, so let's keep reading here a little bit more. It says, yeah, he says cops should have stopped using force when he stopped resisting, which I don't agree with. Chauvin attorney Eric Nelson is due to cross-examine Steger on Wednesday. Steger's testimony follows similar statements from other witnesses that could have included Minnesota Police Chief Medaria Arradonda and Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman, the department's top homicide cop. In other testimony Tuesday, Lieutenant Johnny Mercel, the department's chief use of force instructor, said Chauvin's restraint was not authorized and never has been. I actually really hate that. When I read that, I was like really pissed off because that is not true. That is not true. I've read in many different places articles that cite this particular method as the cops in Minnesota being trained to implement. So I don't know what the hell this guy's talking about. That kind of pissed me off when I read that. I'm like, is this guy just trying to get out of trouble himself? Like, oh, no, I didn't teach him to do that. Even though certainly cops in Minnesota are taught to use that restraint.
What happened to other guys? Other two guys?
The other police officers? Yeah, yes. They were arrested as well. I don't know what's going on with them. I haven't paid attention to their particular cases. Chauvin, 45, is charged with second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter in Floyd's death on May 25th outside a city convenience store. Prosecutors contend Chauvin and 3 other cops caused Floyd's death by ignoring his pleas for air and calls by a crowd of bystanders to take his pulse. Nelson, Chauvin's lawyer, has argued that the bystanders distracted the ex-cops, creating an unsafe environment. It's true. You can see in the video, like, the cops trying to tell the crowd to back off and stuff like that. And says Floyd died due to drug use and a heart ailment. In testimony earlier Tuesday, Nicole McKenzie, the Minneapolis Police Department's medical support coordinator, said all cops on the force are trained to provide CPR and trained in the use of Narcan, a drug used on overdose patients. But that's the thing. I don't think they really knew he was overdosing. I think they just thought he was on drugs.
Yeah.
That's what I think. That's what it looked like to me. But none of the cops provided medical care to Floyd, who was unconscious and had no pulse by the time the paramedics finally arrived at the scene. On cross-examination by Nelson, McKenzie argued that bystanders could provide a distraction to cops on the scene and said that making a judgment on a suspect's medical condition can be difficult under similar circumstances. Well, of course, they're not doctors. They're police officers. They're not doctors. That's the important thing here. They don't have that training. Does it make it more difficult to assess a patient, Nelson asked. Yes, it does, McKenzie replied. Make it more likely that you may miss signs that a patient is experiencing something, ? Nelson followed up. And so the distraction can actually harm the potential care of the patients, ? Potentially, McKenzie said. The trial, which began last week, is expected to last 4 weeks. Nelson will present his defense to the jury after prosecutors conclude their case. I mean, the whole idea this guy's being prosecuted at all, to me, is ridiculous. The guy dies clearly of a drug overdose. To me, that's like very obvious. The guy had to restrain him because he was trying to get out of it. And he restrained him as he was dying of a drug overdose, but maybe couldn't tell that that was what was happening. To me, it's like very obvious what happened here. The only reason this has even gone to trial, I think, is because of the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter movement made a huge deal about this. They started protesting in the streets, burning down buildings, killed a bunch of people, and now somebody's got to pay.
He will pay, unfortunately.
I don't think so. I hope he gets out of it.
He is not. They won't let him out. Even if they will say, yeah, George Floyd did not die from knee on the neck, but because this situation caused such a huge BLM protest in the whole country.
Yeah.
And cause so much damage.
Yeah.
They will still put him in prison.
I don't think so. I think.
Well, I hope not. But for me, it seems like he will not get out of.
I'm an optimist.
Prison.
I say justice will be served. I say Derek Chauvin will be out. Everything will be fine. There will be protests in the streets. They're going to burn more buildings down. They're probably going to kill more people. But that's on Black Lives Matter. That's not on Derek Chauvin.
100% they're going to.
All right, darling.
I'm pissed off.
I'm going to ask you for a favor. It's a big deal. You ready?
Yes.
You ready? Can you read the next article?
No.
Read the next article, woman.
Okay. This is not over. DeSantis blasts 60 Minutes report on Florida's vaccine rollout.
Yeah. So I don't know if you guys have heard about this. I was actually the 60 Minutes thing was sent to me. An article from the Daily Kos was sent to me about this from a Democrat saying, "Toxic masculinity, weekdays 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific."